My name is Emily. I have worked as a nurse for over a decade and have been through many situations, but I never imagined that a simple job could change my life so much. That Friday afternoon, the sun was just starting to set when I received an unexpected call from my nursing agency. I was called to care for a private patient, a wealthy man named Thomas Edwards, who lived in a mansion in the wealthiest part of town. I was instructed to appear immediately, without further details about the situation. I felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension as I drove through the tree-lined streets that led to that exclusive area. As I approached the property, I was amazed at the grandeur of the mansion. It was an imposing building, with a classic architectural style that harkened back to times gone by, with marble columns and a vast front garden adorned with ancient sculptures and sparkling water fountains. I parked my car at the entrance and, with my heart racing, walked towards the main door. An elderly housekeeper, dressed in an impeccable uniform, opened the door before I even had a chance to ring the doorbell. His face had a serious, almost austere look, but his eyes had a welcoming glow. "Miss Emily?" she asked with a slight British accent. I nodded, and she motioned for me to enter. "Mr. Edwards is waiting. I'll take you to him. Follow me, please." I walked through the entrance hall and was struck by the opulence that surrounded me. The floor was white marble, with golden veins that seemed to sparkle in the light of the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The walls were adorned with oil paintings framed in gold, depicting serene landscapes and aristocratic figures. The air smelled like a mix of fresh flowers and a hint of polished wood, creating an atmosphere of refinement and tranquility. We climbed a wide staircase, with a mahogany handrail and steps covered in a thick red carpet that muffled our steps. With each floor, I could feel the history and richness of this place unfolding. We passed through long hallways, the walls of which were decorated with antique tapestries and family portraits that told of the Edwards lineage. Every closed door seemed to hold secrets and untold stories. Finally, the housekeeper stopped in front of a solid wooden door with delicate carvings of flowers and birds. "Here you go, miss. Mr. Edwards is inside," she said, opening the door for me. The room was even more impressive than the rest of the house. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and there was a gray marble fireplace in the corner with a crackling fire that spread a cozy warmth throughout the room. In the center of the room, there was an immense four-poster bed, with red velvet curtains that hung gracefully to the floor. On the bed, a man lay, almost swallowed by the luxurious pillows and blankets. Thomas Edwards was a middle-aged man, but he looked much older than his actual age. His face was pale and lined with wrinkles, with sunken eyes that glowed with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion. His hair, once probably dark and full, was now thin and gray, contrasting with the paleness of his skin. Beside the bed, a woman was standing. She introduced herself as Rebecca, Thomas's wife. Rebecca was a tall, elegant woman with manicured blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to watch my every move with disconcerting intensity. She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, leaving an impression of distrust that I couldn't ignore. "We're so grateful you came so quickly, Emily," Rebecca said, her voice soft and controlled. "Thomas needs constant care, and we are counting on your expertise and discretion." As I looked around that opulent room, with all its riches and luxuries, a feeling of unease began to grow within me. Something was off, a feeling that behind the facade of elegance and wealth there was something deeply wrong. And so, without knowing it, I was about to be plunged into a mystery that would change my life forever. Upon entering the room, I was immediately enveloped by the heavy and opulent atmosphere of the room. The space was large, with tall windows covered in emerald velvet curtains that barely let in daylight. In the center of the room rested a stately bed with an ornate canopy, where Thomas Edwards lay. He was a middle-aged man who, at first glance, appeared to have been drained of his vitality by some unseen evil. His skin was so pale it seemed almost translucent, revealing a map of blue veins underneath. Her eyes, sunken and surrounded by dark shadows, were a reflection of her physical fragility, but there was something about them that intrigued me. It was as if they were constantly alert, watching, waiting for something that never came. As I got closer, I could see that Thomas's breathing was irregular, a slight wheeze filling the oppressive silence of the room. His lips were dry and cracked, and his hands, which rested on the satin sheets, were shaking slightly, as if the simple act of existing required an enormous effort. Beside him, a woman stood, watching my every move with an almost disconcerting intensity. She introduced herself as Rebecca, his wife. Rebecca was a striking figure, tall and slender, with an impeccable posture that exuded a mixture of authority and suspicion. Rebecca had a face that, at first glance, was stunning. Her features were delicate, almost aristocratic, with porcelain skin that contrasted with blonde hair carefully arranged in an elegant bun. However, there was something disturbing about his expression. His blue eyes were cold and calculating, watching me as if I were an intruder in forbidden territory. When she smiled, the smile didn't reach her eyes, making it clear that any sympathy was only superficial. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the dissonance between her appearance and the coldness she emanated. Little by little, I began to notice details that intensified my feeling of discomfort. The way Rebecca always remained very close to Thomas, almost like a watchful shadow, was disconcerting. She seemed to be always on the lookout for anything he might say or do, controlling every aspect of his life with unsettling precision. Thomas, in turn, avoided looking directly at her, and when he did, his eyes reflected a mix of fear and resignation. It was as if he was trapped in an invisible prison, with Rebecca as his jailer. As I performed a preliminary assessment of Thomas, Rebecca watched me with an expression that seemed to defy any attempt at intrusion. She spoke in a soft but firm voice, detailing the care that Thomas should receive, while never ceasing to watch me closely. Her every word seemed carefully calculated, as if she were trying to hide something or keep a secret buried. I couldn't help but feel that there was much more to the situation than I could see at first glance. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, I began my work, determined to find out what was really going on in that opulent and mysterious house. In the early days, my routine at the Edwards mansion was simple and meticulous, marked by an almost mechanical regularity. I arrived early in the morning and went straight up to Thomas's room, where my journey began. The first task was to administer his medications, carefully separated into small labeled bottles. I checked the dosage rigorously, aware of the importance of each pill for Thomas's poor health. I then monitored his vital signs, recording his blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen level readings in a notebook that I kept on hand. It was a repetitive but essential process, which he carried out with the attention of someone who knows that small details can mean the difference between life and death. Thomas, however, looked like a ghost of himself. He spent most of his time lying down, almost motionless, with his eyes lost in some distant point, as if he were constantly absorbed in dark thoughts. Her fragility moved me and, at the same time, made me restless. There was a heavy silence in the air, interrupted only by the occasional sound of her irregular breathing or the faint clink of the utensils I used to administer care. Rebecca was always nearby, almost like a sentry, watching my every move with an attention that was almost oppressive. Her constant presence and the way she hovered around Thomas left me feeling like I was continually being watched. Whenever I tried to engage Thomas in conversation, he seemed withdrawn, almost fearful. Simple questions about how he felt or if he needed anything were met with a slight nod or an evasive response. He rarely looked me in the eye, preferring to look out the window or the ceiling, as if the answers were hidden somewhere beyond my reach. This reticence intrigued me and made me wonder if there was something deeper behind his condition. Sometimes I noticed his eyes filled with a deep, almost desperate sadness, but he never opened up about his feelings or the situation he found himself in. Rebecca, on the other hand, always seemed ready to intervene. If I asked Thomas about his health, she quickly took the floor, answering for him with almost clinical precision. "Thomas is stable, but we need to strictly maintain his medication routine," she said, with a tone that did not admit contradictions. It was as if she was determined to control not only Thomas's health, but information about him as well. It left me with an uncomfortable feeling that something was being carefully hidden. With each failed attempt to talk to Thomas, Rebecca's presence became more suffocating, creating an environment where the truth always seemed out of reach. As the days passed, that silent routine began to weigh on me. I found myself increasingly curious about what was really going on in Thomas's mind, and what could be going on behind Rebecca's facade of normalcy. There was a dark mystery at the Edwards mansion, something that lurked in the shadows and that seemed to be related to Thomas's weakened condition. I felt like I needed to find out the truth, not just as a nurse, but as someone who cared about the well-being of another human being. And so, even amid Rebecca's silence and constant vigilance, I began to look for ways to get closer to Thomas and to uncover the secrets that seemed to surround that house. It was a particularly silent night. The Edwards mansion was plunged into a darkness that seemed almost palpable. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the few lights that were still on. I had finished my chores with Thomas and, before retiring to my assigned room, I decided to take a walk around the house. I felt like something was out of place, a restlessness that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the mansion itself, with its long corridors and doors that seemed to hide undeniable secrets. As I walked through the hallways, my footsteps were muffled by the soft rugs that covered the floor, creating a contrast to the oppressive silence. Passing through the library, I noticed that the light in the study, an adjacent room, was on. The door was ajar, and for a moment I considered whether I should continue on my way or whether I should investigate. That's when I heard a weak voice, but filled with such intense emotion that it made me stop. It was Thomas's voice, broken and almost whispered, as if he was trying to contain the despair that threatened to overflow. "This has to end, Rebecca. I can't live like this anymore." His words were followed by a charged silence, which seemed to stretch infinitely before being broken by a cold, calculated response. It was Rebecca's voice, but different from the controlled, polished persona I knew. There was a hardness in his tone that I had never heard before, an ice that seemed to freeze the very air around it. "You have no choice, Thomas. You know what's at stake." Curious and worried, I approached the door silently, careful not to make any noise. I peeked through the small gap, trying to better understand the situation. The yellow light from a lamp cast elongated shadows that gave Thomas and Rebecca's faces an almost ghostly appearance. Thomas was sitting in a leather chair, his trembling hands gripping the arms of the furniture tightly, as if he needed to anchor himself so as not to be swept away by the current of his own feelings. Her eyes were red, and there was a sheen of unshed tears that spoke of deep, ongoing pain. Rebecca was standing with her back to the door, her arms crossed over her chest. Her posture was rigid, unforgiving, as if she were erecting a barrier between herself and Thomas's anguish. The light from the lamp drew hard contours on her face, highlighting the inflexible expression and the icy look she gave Thomas. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with tension. Every word that came out of Rebecca's mouth seemed like an irrevocable sentence, a decision that could not be challenged. The scene was so intense that I could barely breathe. I could feel Thomas's despair like a thick cloud, surrounding me, suffocating me. He looked like a man on the verge of collapse, desperately trying to hold on to some ray of hope or redemption. Rebecca, on the other hand, was the embodiment of calculating coolness, someone who would not hesitate to do whatever was necessary to achieve her goals, whatever they were. As I watched that scene, a feeling of helplessness overcame me. I wanted to intervene, to say something that might ease the tension or help Thomas in some way, but I knew my presence wouldn't be welcome. This was no ordinary discussion, and the nature of what was at stake seemed to be something much greater than I could comprehend at the time. I felt a lump form in my throat, and a mixture of fear and compassion wash over me. I decided not to interfere, but it stuck in my mind. Thomas's words echoed in my thoughts. I can't live like this anymore. What could be happening so seriously that he felt so desperate? And what did Rebecca mean by, "You know what's at stake"? I spent the rest of the night reflecting on it, trying to piece together a dark puzzle that seemed to be unfolding under the roof of that mansion. With my mind agitated, I retired to my room, but sleep did not come easily. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, forming figures that whispered ancient, forgotten secrets. I felt a growing need to discover the truth, to understand what was happening to Thomas and what Rebecca was hiding. Little did I know that that night was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would change my life forever. That sunny afternoon, while Thomas was resting, I took advantage of the time to tidy the room and leave everything in order. The house was almost completely silent, broken only by the faint sound of leaves blowing in the wind outside. Thomas's room, with its heavy curtains and antique furniture, always seemed to carry an atmosphere of melancholy, as if every object had a painful story to tell. I started with the bed, straightening the satin sheets and smoothing the pillows that adorned the space. It was a simple but necessary job, and it gave me the opportunity to observe the details of that environment full of history. While arranging the sofa next to the window, I noticed something strange between the cushions. When I moved one of them away, I found a small notebook with a black cover, partially hidden. My heart sank when I realized it could be something personal to Thomas. I looked at him, still asleep, his rhythmic breathing indicating a deep sleep. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not I should open the notebook. However, curiosity and the need to understand what was happening overcame my hesitation. I carefully picked up the diary and sat on the edge of the bed to read it. When I opened the first page, I saw Thomas's handwriting, firm but a little shaky. The first notes were dates and routine descriptions of his activities and thoughts. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. However, as I flipped through the pages, the entries began to take on a darker tone. He described the onset of a series of symptoms that began months earlier. "Today, I felt strangely dizzy when I got out of bed," he wrote in one entry. "Sometimes I feel like the ground is moving beneath my feet." These words were accompanied by descriptions of sudden weakness and extreme tiredness, even after small activities. Each new page revealed a gradual deterioration in his health. Thomas would mention how, one moment, he felt fine, but the next moment, he was overcome by an overwhelming feeling of exhaustion. "My hands shake for no apparent reason, and my heart seems to beat irregularly," he reported. "I'm worried about my health, but Rebecca insists it's just stress." His writing conveyed a growing anguish, as if he was desperately trying to understand what was happening to his body, while facing his wife's indifference and relentless control. Then I found an entrance that chilled me to the bone. "I don't know who to trust anymore," Thomas wrote. "I feel a constant sensation of being poisoned. Rebecca controls everything I eat and drink, and I am increasingly convinced that she is slowly trying to kill me." His words were like a punch in the gut. The idea that someone could be poisoning Thomas in such a calculated and methodical way terrified me. His anguish was palpable with every line, and I could almost feel his desperation in my own veins. He was living a silent nightmare, a slow and steady torture, with the person he loved and trusted orchestrating everything from the shadows. I continued reading, increasingly disturbed by the revelations. Thomas described moments of clarity followed by periods of mental confusion. He mentioned how his thoughts seemed cloudy, and his ability to reason was deteriorating. "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing control of my mind," he wrote. "Rebecca says it's just side effects of the medications, but I don't believe her anymore." The diary was a painful testimony of a man caught in a spiral of distrust and fear, struggling to understand what was happening while his own wife entangled him in a web of lies. I closed the diary with shaking hands, feeling a mixture of anger and compassion for Thomas. He was being manipulated and poisoned, and I now had the responsibility to help unravel this dark plot. I put the diary back where I found it, determined to uncover the truth and make sure Thomas received the justice and care he deserved. From that moment on, my mission to the Edwards mansion took a new turn, darker and more urgent than I could have ever imagined. The next morning, the house was enveloped in an unusual stillness. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of Thomas's room, creating intricate patterns of light and shadow on the floor. I felt anxious, an inner turmoil that I hadn't been able to dispel since discovering the diary the day before. With my mind full of questions and my heart heavy, I decided that I couldn't postpone the conversation with Thomas. He needed to know what I had found, and I needed answers to understand the depth of the situation he was involved in. Thomas sat in his leather armchair by the window, wrapped in a silk robe that seemed to emphasize his fragility. His eyes, still cloudy with sleep, turned to me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. As I got closer, my heart beat faster, and I felt a lump in my throat. It was as if the air itself was thick with tension, a foreshadowing of what was to come. I took a deep breath, trying to muster up the courage for the difficult conversation I knew I needed to have. "Thomas," I began, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "I need to talk to you about something very serious." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze narrowing as I continued. "Yesterday, while tidying up my room, I came across your diary. I read some of the entries and was deeply troubled by what you wrote about Rebecca." His reaction was immediate. He tensed, and his eyes widened in a mix of fear and anger. "You shouldn't have done that, Emily," he murmured, his voice an anguished whisper. "I shouldn't have read it. I know it may seem like an invasion, but I needed to understand what was happening to you. And what I read. Thomas, it's very serious. You wrote that Rebecca is poisoning you." The words were barely out of my mouth before I saw how hard they hit him. Thomas looked away, his shoulders slumping as if carrying an unbearable weight. "Is it true?" I asked, trying to keep my tone as gentle as possible. "Is Rebecca really doing this to you?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, his shaking hands gripping the armrest tightly. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and muttered, barely audible, "Yes, it's true." His confession was like a blow, and I felt a wave of shock and revulsion run through me. "She's slowly poisoning me, Emily. I don't have concrete proof, but I know it's her. Rebecca wants the inheritance, but she can't get a divorce because she'd lose everything. So she found this cruel way to get rid of me." I was stunned, my mind struggling to process the monstrosity of what Thomas had just revealed. The woman who was supposed to care for him, the woman with whom he shared his life, was trying to kill him in a meticulous and calculated way. It was hard to believe that someone could be so cold and ruthless. "Thomas, this is horrible," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "I can't imagine what it must be like to live with this constant fear. But we need to do something. We need to prove what's going on." Thomas lifted his head, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "But I'm so tired, Emily. So tired of fighting. Rebecca controls everything, and I feel like I don't have the strength to face her anymore." He seemed on the verge of despair, a man broken by months of manipulation and abuse. I walked over and held his hand, trying to give him some form of comfort and hope. "You're not alone, Thomas," he said firmly. "I'll help you. We'll find a way to expose what Rebecca is doing and make sure you stay safe." Thomas squeezed my hand tighter, his eyes filled with desperate gratitude. "Thank you, Emily. You're the only one I can trust right now. Please help me get out of this. I can't live with this fear anymore." The weight of his plea hit me hard, and I knew I was faced with an enormous responsibility. Determined to help him, I promised myself that I would do everything in my power to prove the truth and ensure that Thomas received the justice he deserved. From that moment on, my mission at the Edwards mansion became clear. I wasn't just a nurse. I was Thomas's only hope in a world where he had been betrayed by the very love of his life. And so, I began to plan my next steps, aware that the road ahead would be full of dangers and challenges, but also determined to bring the truth to light and ensure that justice prevailed. I decided I couldn't ignore Thomas's despair and the dark revelations he had shared. I needed to act, and act quickly, not just for him, but also for my own sanity. Knowing that someone was being slowly destroyed in silence was unbearable for me. So that very afternoon, I reached out to a trusted friend, someone I knew could help expose Rebecca and ensure justice was served. I called Mike, an old friend who worked in law enforcement and who had always been a reliable source of support and guidance. I met him in a discreet cafe, away from the prying eyes that could compromise our conversation. As we drank bitter coffee, I told him everything in detail, from the discovery of the diary to Thomas's anguished confession. Mike listened intently, his eyes hardening as the gravity of the situation became clear. "Emily, this is very serious," he said, after a few moments of reflection. "We need to act very carefully. If Rebecca notices any suspicious movement, she may accelerate her plan or destroy all evidence." I agreed, feeling the urgency of the situation. Together, We began to devise a meticulous plan to collect evidence of the poisoning. Mike suggested that the first step would be to obtain samples of the food and drinks that Thomas consumed, as well as monitoring the medications that Rebecca was administering. We needed concrete evidence so that the police could act and to ensure that Rebecca did not get away with it. "We're going to need a little luck and a lot of care," he said, as he scribbled notes on a pad. "If she really is as careful as you describe, it will be difficult, but not impossible." I decided the best way to obtain the samples would be to disguise my actions as part of Thomas's routine care. I began to carefully observe all the food and drinks that were served to him, noting the times and composition of each meal. With Mike's help, I obtained a small collection kit that would allow me to collect samples without arousing suspicion. Each time I brought Thomas a tray, I discreetly collected a small portion of food or some of the liquid he was supposed to drink. Within a few days, I was able to gather a considerable amount of samples that Mike sent for analysis at a forensic laboratory. Meanwhile, I also started paying more attention to the medications Rebecca gave Thomas. She always insisted on administering the medicine herself, a practice that, in light of Thomas's revelations, seemed more sinister than caring. To avoid arousing suspicion, I began to closely observe each pill and bottle she used, making detailed notes about the doses and appearance of each medication. I was also able to replace some of the medicines with harmless versions, a safety measure to ensure that, at least for a few days, Thomas wasn't receiving anything that could harm him further. With samples in hand and medication monitoring underway, I began to feel like we were making progress. However, the tension in the house only increased. Rebecca seemed increasingly vigilant, her eyes following me with growing suspicion. I knew that time was running out and that any false step could ruin everything. Each night before bed, I mentally reviewed the plan, making sure there were no flaws that could be exploited by Rebecca. Despite the challenges and constant risk, the prospect of exposing the truth gave me the strength to continue. With each new piece of evidence collected, I felt like we were one step closer to saving Thomas and ensuring Rebecca paid for her crimes. With each passing day, the net we were weaving around her grew a little tighter, and I knew that, soon, the truth would finally come out. As the days went by, it became increasingly apparent that Rebecca was becoming suspicious of my growing closeness to Thomas. His behavior, previously just cold and distant, began to take on an openly hostile tone. The tension in the house was palpable, as if the air was permeated with electricity, and I could feel his eyes following my every move. The mansion, which already seemed like a place of secrets and shadows, became a true silent battlefield, where my every action was meticulously monitored. It all started to get worse one afternoon when I was in Thomas's room, adjusting his pillows and checking his vitals. Rebecca entered suddenly, without knocking, and her gaze was icy. She watched me for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line, before speaking in a voice that dripped with venom. "Emily, you are here to take care of my husband, not to pry into our private lives." His words were like a sharp blade, cutting through the air and leaving a deep mark. There was an underlying threat in his tone that gave me goosebumps. I tried to remain calm, taking a deep breath before responding. "I'm just fulfilling my duties, Rebecca. Thomas needs constant care, and I'm here to make sure he gets the best treatment possible." My words were simple, but Rebecca saw through the facade of professionalism. Her piercing gaze never left me as she took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "Watch your boundaries, Emily. Don't think I don't understand what you're trying to do here." His voice was a menacing whisper, and the cold in his eyes sent a chill down my spine. Each day, Rebecca became more aggressive, her attempts to intimidate me more overt and less covert. On several occasions, she made a point of being present during my visits to Thomas, watching my every gesture with an almost paranoid vigilance. "Do you think you can come into our house and change everything?" she asked one day, her voice full of sarcasm. "You're just a nurse. Remember your place." The coldness in his words was cutting, and I knew I was treading dangerous ground. Rebecca didn't limit herself to verbal confrontations. He started making it difficult for me to access Thomas's medicine and food, trying to keep me away from any possibility of collecting evidence. Whenever I approached something that could be a clue, it appeared like a shadow, ready to block my path. There were moments when I could almost feel the hatred emanating from her, a dense energy that permeated the room and made my task even more challenging. Despite the mounting pressure and veiled threats, I knew I couldn't give up. Thomas's life was at stake, and every day that passed without action was another day that he suffered at Rebecca's hands. I was determined to carry out the plan Mike and I had devised, collecting all the evidence necessary to expose the truth. Rebecca could try to intimidate me, but she couldn't stop me. I was Thomas's last line of defense, and the responsibility of saving him was a weight I was willing to carry until the end. Each night, when I retired to the small room assigned to me, I reviewed the day's events and planned my next steps. I knew Rebecca was getting desperate, and that made her even more dangerous. But I also knew that the truth was within my reach and that, with a little more patience and determination, I would be able to unmask his dark intentions. Rebecca's counterattack was fierce, but my determination was even greater. The battle was just beginning, and I was ready to face whatever came my way in defense of Thomas and the truth. After weeks of tension and meticulous evidence gathering, I finally felt like we had enough evidence to confront Rebecca and expose her crimes. With the support of Mike, who had managed to analyze all the food and medicine samples, we were shocked to discover the terrible truth. Rebecca was in fact mixing small doses of poison into Thomas's medicine. Each lab result confirmed that she had been poisoning him slowly, almost imperceptibly, which explained his strange symptoms and steadily deteriorating health. With the evidence in hand, we went to the police department. Mike accompanied me, and together we presented all the evidence to the detective in charge of the case, a man named Johnson, who immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He assured us that he would act quickly to prevent Rebecca from escaping or destroying further evidence. A feeling of relief mixed with growing anxiety took over me. I knew we were about to face one of the most difficult and decisive battles in that dark saga. That morning, the Edwards mansion was enveloped in a deceptive calm. Mike and I stayed in the car, parked discreetly across the street, watching the commotion as the police prepared to enter the house. Time seemed to drag by, each minute an eternity, until we finally saw the police approaching the main entrance. The loud knocking on the door echoed through the house, a sound that seemed to resonate with the promise of justice. Rebecca answered, and I could see from afar the surprise and fear on her face as she was confronted by the officers. The scene that followed was tense and dramatic. Rebecca tried to maintain her composure, denying any accusations and insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was irrefutable. With samples of adulterated food and medicine, as well as my detailed notes and testimony from Thomas, who was now willing to speak openly about his suffering, the truth finally came out. The officers had no choice but to handcuff Rebecca and take her to the police station on charges of attempted murder. Thomas, who watched everything from his room, was visibly shaken but also relieved. When the police officers left, I went up to the room to be by their side. "It's over, Thomas," he said softly, trying to convey some form of comfort. "She can't hurt you anymore." He looked at me with eyes full of gratitude and pain, still trying to process everything that had happened. I don't know how to thank you, Emily," he murmured, his voice breaking with emotion. "You saved my life." With Rebecca locked up, the next step was to ensure Thomas received the medical treatment he so desperately needed. Mike made arrangements for him to be transferred immediately to a hospital where he could be cared for by specialists. The admission process was quick, and soon Thomas was under the care of a dedicated medical team who began treating the effects of the poisoning. The first few days were difficult, with many tests and adjustments to treatments, but little by little, he began to show signs of recovery. Over the next few weeks, I visited Thomas in the hospital regularly. With each visit, he seemed a little stronger, a little closer to regaining the health and vitality that Rebecca had tried to steal from him. It was as if a heavy cloud was slowly being lifted, revealing the man he could be without his wife's sinister shadow. The colors returned to his face, and he began to smile again. A smile that I hadn't seen in a long time and that filled me with hope. Investigations continued, revealing more about Rebecca's cruel methods. We discovered that she had been planning the poisoning for months, purchasing small amounts of poison and mixing it into Thomas's medicines so that he would never suspect. His motivation was clear: inheritance. With Thomas out of the way, she would become the sole beneficiary of his vast fortune, something a divorce would not guarantee her. The coldness and precision with which she had carried out her plan shocked everyone, but now, with the evidence incontrovertible, there was no doubt that she would face justice for her crimes. Rebecca out of the picture, Thomas's life finally began to improve. He received psychological and emotional support to overcome the trauma he had experienced, and I was by his side throughout the process, helping him find the strength to start over. The house, which was once a place of suffering and fear, was now full of possibilities for a brighter future free from the darkness of the past. With Rebecca finally out of the picture, a new era has begun in Thomas's life. It was as if the shadow that hung over him had been dispelled, allowing light to enter and transform every aspect of his existence. The first few weeks after his recovery in the hospital were a time of adjustments and new beginnings. He was fragile, both physically and emotionally, but each day brought with it small signs of progress and hope. Her skin, once pale and lifeless, began to take on a healthier tone, and her eyes, which had once carried the weight of despair, now glowed with a new determination. I remained by Thomas's side, first as his nurse and gradually as a close friend and confidant. The daily physical therapy sessions and medical care needed for his recovery became a routine, but also an opportunity for our friendship to flourish. I discovered in Thomas a deeply sensitive and intelligent man, someone who, despite everything he had been through, still had incredible strength of spirit. Our conversations, which began with trivial topics about health and recovery, soon delved into more personal and meaningful topics. He shared his hopes and fears, and I did the same, creating a bond that went beyond the patient-nurse relationship. Over time, Thomas began to explore new possibilities for his life. He sold the mansion that was filled with painful memories and moved to a smaller house in a quiet and welcoming neighborhood. It was a simple house, but full of potential to become a home. I helped him decorate his new space, choosing light colors and comfortable furniture that reflected his new perspective on life. Together, we planted a small garden in the backyard, where Thomas liked to spend his afternoons tending to the plants and enjoying the serenity that had long been denied him. Our relationship has evolved in ways I never could have predicted. What began as a simple mission to care for a patient turned into a deep and meaningful friendship. Thomas told me that during his darkest moments, my presence had been a beacon of hope for him. I, on the other hand, realized that Thomas had taught me a lot about resilience and the importance of never giving up, no matter the circumstances. Together, we began to make plans for the future, plans that involved travel, new experiences, and, above all, a life free from secrets and mistrust. Thomas's freedom opened doors to many new opportunities. He decided to dedicate part of his time and resources to causes close to his heart, such as creating a foundation to help people in vulnerable situations. It was a way of turning his pain into something positive, helping those who, like him, had suffered in silence. I supported him every step of the way, helping to organize events and campaigns, and watching him flourish in his new role as benefactor. His gratitude for the second chance life had given him was palpable, and he was committed to making a difference in the lives of others. Now, as close friends, we are building a future together, a future filled with possibility and hope. Thomas and I have become partners in life and the adventures it holds for us. Every day, we renew our commitment to living without secrets, valuing the honesty and trust that we lacked so much in the past. Our story, marked by suffering and overcoming, is a constant reminder that, even in the darkest hours, the light of hope can shine, guiding us to a new beginning, full of promise and happiness.